file on the wall.
From wherever you happen to be sitting, your disciplinary perspective, your decades as a journalist, someone who's followed Trump, how do you think this all happened? How did he win?
Well, a series of events came together. First of all, Hillary Clinton had a lot of baggage, and as Donna Brazil's book Hacks shows, she ran a poor campaign and would not listen to the advice of people who told her she needed to pay attention to what Trump was doing. Secondly, the Republicans ran a field we used to all call the clown car of utterly unqualified people, so that his lack of qualification wasn't so noticeable. I mean, the one qualified candidate in that field was John Kasich. You can dislike his politics, but I don't think anybody would dispute that he's a serious person. Next, Donald ran on an economic platform that came out of my trilogy: Perfectly Legal on Taxes, Free Lunch on Subsidies, and the Fine Print on Monopolies and Lack of Competition. And I know that Donald doesn't read books, but I know he watched me on TV because he talked to other people who told me about it. And he distilled the basic message in that book. In 2012, the bottom 90% of Americans who file a tax return reported a smaller income than in 1967. And 45 years, and their incomes are smaller. The bottom 90% of Americans have real, legitimate grievances, and Donald tapped into that. The problem is he's a con artist who, of course, promised to drain the swamp, and then he stocked it with swamp monsters. And a factor in this also was the utter failure of journalists to vet Donald Trump. You can read about Barack Obama's kindergarten playmates in Indonesia by name, the boys he smoked dope with in high school by name, some of the women he dated in college by name. But the New York Times, in the 16 months from Trump's announcement to Election Day, had exactly 4 references that had Trump and mafia in the same story, and they were all in passing and inconsequential. So there was a complete failure to tell people about, Trump's deep involvement with this international cocaine trafficker, where he did things that make no sense unless they were in business together, and then everything makes sense. They didn't tell about his 2 income tax fraud trials that he lost. Just a lot of stuff about Trump was never reported because his campaign was like, looking at a car crash on the other side of the highway, only it had dancing girls, a marching band, and you couldn't turn away from it. The Republicans for 40 years have done serious work preparing for the day when, as a minority party, they wanted to still be in control. So they've reduced the franchise. They've passed laws like this horrible law in Michigan that lets you throw out ballots on the most bogus grounds, entire precinct. All that combined to help Trump win the Electoral College. And what is the purpose of the Electoral College? The framers put it there so that if a madman or a zealot or the mob, as they thought of pure democracy, were to put an inappropriate person in the presidency by popular vote, the Electoral College would block that. Well, it's atrophied, and it didn't work.
With the Electoral College, thinking about, again, not an irony in terms of Trump and his sort of white identity politics, was explicitly designed to protect slavery and the power of slave states. You can connect the dots, as I like to say, from the Southern strategy to the Tea Party to Palinism to right-wing conspiranoid fantasies to gerrymandering and voter suppression. And now you have this man who's in power, because you have the long view about, again, the Fourth Estate and its failings. Chomsky famously talked about we went from journalism to the news media and all the problems that caused. Was the mainstream corporate news media, did they not vet him, and did they try to normalize him simply because they wanted access to power?
2 things happened here that are very important. First of all, remember that campaign reporters cover the horse race, and journalists have been wringing their hands since Teddy White's book in 1961 about, covering the sizzle and not the steak. But secondly, in 2012, Donald ran. And there were only 2 journalists, to my knowledge, who said he's only running for a new contract with MDC and he'll quit his campaign as soon as he gets it. And that was Lawrence O'Donnell and me. And we said it within hours of each other, same day or maybe one day apart. And politics reporters who bought into this and who didn't listen when, I told some of them directly, this is nonsense. He's not really running. Don't treat him as a serious candidate. They had egg on their face. So when he announced on June 16th of 2015, and that very day I started telling people, hey, you need to pay attention. He's serious. He might win. I don't think he will, but he might. They were like, oh, come on, it's just a vanity project. They just didn't get onto it. And then everybody was so fascinated with his unconventional campaign, they forgot about the basics. I actually talked about this at City University of New York shortly after the election. It might have been January of last year. And I was on a panel with 4 journalists, Grace Huang, who used to be the managing editor of Reuters, somebody whose name I frankly don't remember, and Carolyn Ryan, who was in charge of political coverage. And I went first, and I started off saying, I want to be very clear about something because you're going to hear some very sharp criticism of the New York Times. I love the New York Times. It is the greatest newspaper in the world. Flaws and all, nothing comes close to it. But the Times really blew it on the Trump campaign. Completely failed in its obligation, and it wasn't that I wasn't calling editors at the Times, although I didn't call Carolyn Ryan and say, you're really blowing this story. And then I told how I had called one particular editor who I was pretty close to, and I talked about the drug trafficker, Joe Wexelbaum. And the question to me was, well, when was this? And I said, basically the 80s. And the editor said, my goodness, David, that is so long ago. Nobody cares. I said, hey, wait a minute. We vetted George Bush's childhood and Hillary Clinton's, and, that's nonsense. Well, nobody's going to care. It's too old. Guess what the next Sunday's page 1 major story was? What Hillary Clinton was doing in Arkansas in the 1970s. So there was just a blind eye to this, but I think it had entirely to do with everybody was so taken by his unusual campaign that they just forgot about the basic. And I understand from friends, the Times internally has had some very serious discussions about this. And of course, I'm not exactly beloved of Times editors because of my willingness to publicly criticize the paper.
Is a nuts and bolts question. Just educate me if you would. A 5th grader in a high school could have found out all this stuff about Trump and his dealings. Obviously, you and other folks have done some serious, very sophisticated investigative reporting, but I'll use an example.
Yeah, once it's done, anybody can find it if they just look.
Yeah. So is it like in the editorial meetings, is it folks are pitching stories and they're saying, we know about there's mafia connections. We have these questions about real estate. We have these concerns about Russia.
Everybody knows that. That's all old stuff. Everybody knows that. Well, that's true if you live in Manhattan. I mean, I think pretty much everybody in Manhattan knows that Donald Trump is a skunk. But that's not true just in Rochester, where I live. It's not true to this day. I mean, my favorite communication in all of this time is from a woman in Indiana. Mr. Johnston, I saw you on television. I don't understand why you keep attacking our president now that we finally have a fine Christian family man of integrity in the White House. If you read Breitbart and WND and Newsmax, you would believe that.
And I try not to laugh because, I mean, the whole thing is so surreal, but it's a nightmare because you literally couldn't believe this.
But Chauncey, you grew up around New York. You have a totally different impression than people only know him from that TV show and who believe he's this fantastic businessman. And by the way, this problem, let me tell you how badly it continues. Donald Trump claimed on the day he announced he was worth $8.7 billion. He later said 10, more than 10, and once he said 11. When he filed his financial disclosure statement after taking office, first of all, they asked if his lawyer, Sherry Dillon, asked if he could file it without signing it under penalty of perjury, and was told, no, you're going to file it, you have to sign it. Well, it only shows $1.4 billion. If you take all of the 50 million up items and double them, you don't get to $2 billion. Nobody wrote a story saying Donald Trump under oath has now revealed it was all a con. How can that be? I mean, if I were at the New York Times still, if I was told, that's not a story, I would have literally gone to the executive editor's office and bigfooted meaning pulling out my Pulitzer. It's unbelievable to me that wasn't page 1 news.
Is there anybody in the room saying we have an obligation to educate the public so they can be responsible citizens?
I wasn't in those rooms, but I expect somebody probably did, or you wouldn't say it that way in a Times news meeting, but you would say, yes, but nonetheless, we need to do this. And they didn't. Well, we're supposed to scrub people, and some candidates have been better scrubbed than others. I think it was primarily his campaign was so unconventional and the hubris of thinking, well, we all know about what a scum he is. And then, of course, newspapers, Chauncey, have never been comfortable writing about the nexus between the mob and the legitimate world. Remember, the mob controlled the distribution of all the newspapers in New York, so they were always very sensitive about that.
What does the public need to know about this man to understand his behavior? What is the key to understanding what he's doing?
The key things people should know about him are this. He comes from a family of criminals. His grandfather was a German draft dodger who lied to become a citizen and who made his fortune running whorehouses in Seattle, Everett, Washington, and the Yukon Territory. His father, Fred, had a business partner, Willie Tomasello, who's an associate of the Gambino and Genovese crime families, and there are official government public reports about this, and who ripped off the U.S. government for, in today's money, $36 million. Eisenhower threw a fit in the White House over this.